Hi, my name is Lisa Yebuah, and I'm the host for this webinar series, Now and Next, How the Church is Changing for Good. And we are so grateful that you have joined us for our third episode. Just to ground ourselves before we move into this wonderful time together to talk about preaching in an empty room, I want us to ground ourselves that we can really be present to this moment. So I'm going to invite you to just respond in the stillness of the space that you're in right now to these two questions. The first one is this: what do you need to let go of in order to be present to this moment? Maybe there's a task that's still looming over your head. Maybe you're carrying some anxiety or worry. Maybe a conversation went sideways and you're still playing it on repeat. What might it look like if you let that go so you can be present to this moment? And here's the second question. What do you want from this moment? In John's gospel, it says that Jesus turns around and he sees that the disciples are following after him, and he asks them the question, what do you want, or what are you looking for? We all come with expectations. We all come anticipating something. Is it to glean new information? Is it to know that you're connected to other people who are working in the church, who are trying to love and lead their people well? Is it just simply for your heart to stop racing because you know that you can do this because you're going to get some information today? What is it that you want from this moment? May it be in the courage of letting go and of also asking God for good and beautiful things, that the information that we hear today will be turned into transformation that will change the way in which you do your beautiful work in loving God's people well. If you missed our other episodes, you can find them on amplifymedia.com/now and next, and it'll give you a snapshot of all of the conversations that we've had up to this point. But this series is to help church leaders and pastors navigate this season of a pandemic, which none of us have been here before. I jokingly say to all of my colleagues that when I went to seminary, there was not a class on pastoring through a pandemic. And in our survey, we found that many of you shared that preaching and preaching effectively and figuring out ways to connect in the preaching moment when you're not actually in the presence of your congregants was very high on the list of concerns that you have. And so today we have some beautiful practitioners who are going to help us in preaching and preaching online, and those who also know how to teach homiletics. And so I'm so grateful for these three beautiful panelists who are going to share with us today. I want to introduce you to Charley Reeb.
Hello, good to see everybody. I hope I look beautiful.
And Charley, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the context in which you serve?
Sure. I am currently the senior pastor of John Street United Methodist Church, just north of Atlanta. I've been at this church for almost 2 years. Before that, I served many, many years in Florida. I also teach preaching. I've taught preaching for years at licensed to preach schools and course of study programs in seminary. And so homiletics and preaching is certainly a passion of mine. I've written a few books about it as well. And so I really feel a calling, in addition to serving as a pastor, to help other preachers hone their craft in preaching as well.
Grateful to have you. We're also happy to have Bruce Reyes-Chow with us.
Howdy. Good to be with you all.
And Bruce, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm in Palo Alto, California, serving First Presbyterian Church at Palo Alto. I've only been here for about a year. My history is Presbyterian Church USA. Have been pastoring for about 25 years, been a church planter, an interim pastor. I've written some books and do a lot of speaking and that kind of thing. I think the main reason I'm probably here is I've been leading and teaching online community, social media, technology, and consulting and coaching pastors around all the elements of that. So I'm excited to be here with you all.
And for the other Lisa Thompson, who's with us. Oh, hold on, we're gonna make sure.
Hello,
yeah.
Amen. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Thompson. I am the Associate Professor of Homiletics and Liturgics at Vanderbilt University's Divinity School and Graduate Department of Religion. I have been teaching preaching in the classroom in some capacity for about 11 years. I've been a professor for 7 and have been preaching and ordained preaching in ministry fashion for about 14 years. So I'm a teacher of preachers and a teacher of those who want to be teachers of preachers.
Put that on a t-shirt.
Right.
I like that. Yeah.
Like a button.
Yeah. As a preacher myself, it is quite a strange phenomenon to be preaching from my kitchen table, to preach to an empty room, especially coming out of a tradition where I am so used to having the feedback of others. But as we dive in, I'd love to hear from you all. In what ways is preaching to a camera not all that different to preaching to people in a room? Maybe that can quell some of our fears.
Well, I'll jump in and say, for me, I mean, that's a good question because I think it goes into the importance of rehearsing your sermon and practicing it, so to speak. I think oftentimes when I go through the process myself of preparing a sermon and then preparing to preach it, I visualize and imagine the congregation in front of me as I do it. And how I personally do it is actually speak it out. I know people do, prepare in different ways, but for me, I imagine speaking to the congregation. I imagine seeing the people I'm going to see on this row or that row and how they may feel when I say this. And so I try to get myself into a space when I'm rehearsing and preparing a sermon that will prepare me for that moment when I'm preaching it, whether it be in front of a camera or in front of actual people. So I think in many ways it's the same. If you can visualize and imagine the people listening as you're preaching to a camera and getting into that state, I think it makes it a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
If I could build on this, I appreciate Charley's imagery of imagining people. So often in the classroom, I try to tell people, remind people that we are not preaching ideas or talking about ideas, somehow that we want to conjure forth an experience or a connection, and that we want to connect with people's mind, heart, and body in the preaching moment. So that means often trying to visualize the human experience, what we feel. I often use the senses. What do we smell? What do we taste? What do we touch? What do we feel in this moment? To think about how do we imagine the human connection to this message. So it's not about communicating just an idea. It is about creating an experience of the thing.
Mm-hmm. Like that.
I've been preaching online in a variety of contexts for a lot of years, and so it's not much different. I mean, I think the congregation I'm at now it has been a more traditionally liturgical congregation, but the deal was when I got there that I was just going to be me. So, they're used to having robes and stoles and all this, and I don't do any of that. I walk, I practice a little, kind of beforehand, but it's really more engaging in the community and the conversation and bringing the things that I've been called to bring into that space. And so it's basically the same thing we do on Zoom. Our services are not recorded. Everybody's there. We've really focused on creating community that's not much different. It's just happening in a different space. So I have multiple screens set up so I can see people as they're reacting to what I'm saying right here. There's a second screen over here so I can just kind of see what's going on. And we encourage people to talk entirely all through worship through our chat room. So there's things going on and folks will flash something up to me that I'll shift a little bit. I'm slide driven, so they actually aren't seeing my face other than the little small box on the corner. And so that's normative to our worship experience anyway. So in some ways, I think we're really fortunate. It's a very comfortable space for me. So what that has done has just lessened all the anxiety for the people who, for this is so weird and so strange that they were like, well, if Bruce isn't worried about it and it's not stressing about it, then I guess it might be okay. So I think that has allowed this community that probably would not have done it with previous leadership, just be generational, stylistic, all those kind of things, not good or bad. But we've all been talking about God did something to bring us together in the last year. And then this is all happening. And now we're kind of living into our best selves as a community, as a preacher, as a congregation. And the second thing I would say is my preaching has always been about a constant dialogue with the community. So sermons are out of my conversations through that whole week, out of our online gatherings, out of all of that. So it doesn't feel much different to people. It's just happening on a different platform. And that's kind of what we've tried to do, is just say, this is pretty much the same. We're just doing it in a different space. And people are getting more and more comfortable with that.
Maybe I'll ask the kind of the alternate question, and that is, in what ways, though, is preaching online or preaching via a digital platform different than actually preaching with people in person? And then what would you say to pastors who are struggling with preaching in front of a camera, how they reconcile those realities?
Well, I think certainly for me, and I think everyone listening and watching, and certainly Bruce and Lisa would appreciate this, but there's no substitute for actually preaching to people in person. There is an energy there, a palpable energy that can't be substituted, and you feel it and you sense it, and it's a nuance, and you sense people reacting, and sometimes subconscious ways as you're preaching, and you respond to that. So it is a bit different, and I do think it takes a while to get used to. I think the more you do it, it does get a bit easier. But yeah, it is challenging, especially if you're used to doing that, of feeling that energy from the people. And I guess the second part of your question, to come back around to what I said earlier, I think this particular challenge gives a lot of preachers an opportunity maybe to revamp how they prepare for sermons. Because I think the more they get into, as Lisa was talking about earlier, rehearsing an experience, imagining the people they're preaching to, and imagining how they're going to feel when something is said, and how they're going to imagine how they're going to experience that journey. If you prepare in that way, imagining that, I think when you're in front of a camera, it's a little bit easier to get into that state. And I think it goes back to how you prepare and how you rehearse. I'm clearly a believer in practicing and rehearsing sermons. And so I think that makes it easier for people. And maybe preachers will start doing that if they've never done it before. I think it does make it a little bit easier.
Okay, I'll jump in. We're all like, you can see our fingers on our non-mute buttons. I think I'm not sure I agree, Charlie. I mean, I do think that you can practice experience in the nuance of online community. I think there have been communities that have been doing it for a long time. And I think it's deciding whether you as a preacher are finding that same space and finding your comfort level within a particular medium. And not every preacher is comfortable in all of them. And I think for me, the biggest difficulty is as I've seen colleagues and I've talked with colleagues, we are over functioning and trying to be perfect when there is an abundance of grace and empathy out there right now. And so I actually think in some ways it's a time to risk not being the preacher in the same way that you used to be. I mean, obviously I am not a traditional preacher. And in terms of manuscripts and those kinds of things. So, but not everybody can do that. And so when I have interns come through, everybody tries to copy a style. And I think this is a great time to understand we can all develop our own style of online preaching. And it's not going to be the same for everybody. Just rather than I think there has been this kind of archetype of a preacher. Now we have this freedom to just play with stuff because I think there's an abundance of grace out there for people. And we get to break some walls down that we're separated by space of a sanctuary, that in some ways we're much more intimate now. If you're on a Zoom call, there isn't this distance. You're like right there. And I think that part of our experience and the way that we're doing it now, other folks are recording. And so it's truly an empty room. But if you're doing it the way we're doing it, everybody's there. It's interactive. You do have the intimacy of your words. People are hearing them right then and there. And so there isn't this, you can't be perfect. You can't be, all that. So I think there's a great opportunity right now for preachers to just embrace the discomfort, embrace the possibility that's not always going to be great, let go of over functioning and the seeking of perfection, and use an opportunity to kind of grow into being a different kind of preacher that is, quite frankly, I think for most churches if you don't hone your online preaching muscle, you're gonna be in trouble, because this is gonna be around for a long time. I think we're talking about, we're having congregations, churches thinking about 2021, thinking about Easter, thinking about, what does it look like when you're doing these hybridized experiences. And I think it's a great time to kind of hone that online preaching muscle and really own it and enjoy it and thrive in it.
I'm thinking about the idea that I like to say people have multiple levels or variations of their preaching voice, or kind of preaching personas, but that's no less authentically them. And I appreciate, Bruce, the challenge to lean into that. I'm also mindful my lawn maintenance has shown up. So as I'm talking, I am trying to talk over a lawnmower.
This is legit and real. This is like what?
Well,
these are the things that sermons are made of.
That's right. The stuff sermons are made of. So, but as I'm thinking about this idea, though, it is a time to experiment, to take the risk, and to know that things will be different, but you'll be no less authentic to who you are. And we come into our preaching voices by experimenting. This might be an opportunity to find a new dimension of a preaching persona, as I like to call it, or our preaching voice. And there are some things we just can't get around. Preaching for broadcast media is completely different, or communicating for broadcast media is completely different than preaching or talking to someone face to face. But I do not think that's what we're after. We are not after preaching and crafting messages for broadcast media. And this time, folk are just trying to do the best they can to get a decent message out there that connects with people. So, but even with that being said, I want preachers to remember that, digital communication flattens emotions. It flattens affect. So sometimes our gestures have to be larger. We have to fake eye contact with the camera instead of looking at ourselves in the Hollywood squares, just to think about how do we kind of curate closeness and intimacy even across digital media. And the last thing that I did want to say there is that as we think about experimenting, this may be a time, if you're used to high steeple pulpit preaching, and instead of setting up the camera still in the sanctuary, it may be a time to move the camera closer, sit on the sofa, and do a 7-minute sermon instead of a 15-minute, 30-minute sermon.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Lisa, Charley, were you going to say something?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think it's important too, because I think what we're talking about right now are just a variety of ways of preaching, that one no less than the other. I think, Bruce, I'm trying to imagine what you're doing, which sounds exciting and very creative in terms of communicating a message in a medium and in a way on a computer that's maybe you're with other people in Zoom, and that's certainly a way to do a sermon. And I think we're also talking about putting up cameras in a sanctuary, if you have those resources, and recording a sermon as you preach in that setting. So I think there's different ways of preaching messages and presenting the message. And I think we're talking about 2 or 3 different ways of doing that. I still think there is a place. Clearly, I think a lot of preachers have gotten into that space where their videos are more personal. They're speaking for 5 to 7 minutes devotionals in their kitchen or in their living room. But I still think there's a place and there's a hunger for people who do desire that sermon event out there, whether it's in the sanctuary or in another particular place. I still think there is a need, at least in my experience, and a desire for that. And I think there's are different rules apply to that when you're doing that, to do it effectively.
I think, Charley, just in hearing the very ways that we're answering this question, we are understanding the fact that context matters, and how will they hear unless someone is sent? And there's something about the one who is sent and those who are going to receive the message. Like, we also know how the word lands for people, and to be authentic in that, based on how we know the people that God has called us to serve. I do want to shift and ask this question: how has preaching to a camera changed your approach to teaching?
Change your approach to teach. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. I'm sorry. I'm just going to jump in here thinking about this semester. I was in the middle of teaching 2 preaching courses, and then pandemic hit, right? So we're thrown out of the live classroom to an online platform. And so I literally had to go with it. So there were a couple options for that second sermon. I gave students the options to figure out how they wanted to preach, to actually take the risk. I think the classroom or teaching preaching is all about risk taking and helping people take risks in safer spaces. So I feel like in one way it changed to say, okay, now we're forced to think about this in a digital capacity. What do you wear? Where do you stand? Do you create a mini pulpit at home or lectern, or do you sit down and create this more intimate space? But for me, it was kind of a both and. It was, yes, something different in terms of we actually have to experiment with this now. And then it was a little bit of the same in terms of encouraging risk-taking, creativity, and peer feedback in that process. But I did also recognize that I had to create opportunities for just a little bit of information about how to communicate across the digital platform in terms of eye contact with the camera, where do you want your camera situated, those things did change a little bit. Charlie, I'm done if you want to jump in.
No, that's great. I mean, maybe I'm too one-dimensional, which is why I need this conversation with y'all to stretch me. But when you ask that question, the first thing that comes to my mind is not much has changed. I mean, I teach preaching through video for Emory. They see these videos before they come to class in person, and so that's part of their experience. And so I teach in front of the camera for those videos the same way I would teach in a classroom. I just imagine the camera as my students, and I interact with the camera the way I would interact with them. Same way with my preaching. When you talk about how does the digital medium change, again, maybe I'm just shallow and one-dimensional, but I just look at the camera and preach like I'm preaching to people. That's how I think about it. Mm-hmm. So for me, nothing changes. I'm just preaching to people. So, but again, that's why I need this conversation to see what other people are doing. Maybe I need to do more.
I am not in the academia. I'm a proud dropout of 2 DMin programs for good reasons.
Oh, nice. Was one of them Vanderbilt?
It was not Vanderbilt. It was one of those that was like, well, this is what I'm supposed to do next. And then you get into it and you're like, why am I doing this again? In any case. But I think I'm always about take advantage of the benefits of the platform. So in our teaching, and when I think about our teaching and our worship as teaching moments, like we now can bring people in from all over the world to come in and do an offering time. Like we've just been bringing people, our partners who we support, and just like, all right, can you come in and give 2 minutes? And I mean, we have music that's coming in from all over the place, and to figure out what platforms, what you're given, and then take advantage of those to expand the experience of what people are experiencing. I think that's in many ways, Charlie, I agree with you, right? We're just doing worship the same way we always do worship. But now we have this expansive platform that I've always wanted to get rid of passing the plates. We stopped to passing the plate about 3 months ago. And so now, we don't have to, but now it's like, okay, instead of even we're trying to fake a moment of offering something, now we bring somebody in and they get to talk for a few minutes. We throw some links into the chat room. People are giving to individuals so I think there's so much opportunity to just expand on people's understanding of what it means to gather. Because I think we want what we're used to, and the great thing is now I don't have to convince anybody about this new program. It's just happened to us.
Yeah, they're forced.
Right. And so it's like all right, I guess we're gonna do Zoom. I'm like, I would have wanted us to do this, a long time ago. And now everybody's like, all right, let's do it. And I'm like, great, okay, there we go. So I think taking advantage of this moment is a gift. There's no silver lining to the pandemic, but there are these moments of grace that appear that I think we can capture and kind of live into some new life out of so much despair. And that's kind of how I'm kind of pitching it to our folks. Like, here's a moment of light and love and joy right now. Let's hold on to this and bring in this person who's doing frontline work to allow us to stay home. Those kinds of things that we're trying to do is to take advantage of the platform to enhance the things we're trying to teach and share.
I do want to go back to Lisa's, I felt like you're almost giving us some commentary around some of the best practices. And I want to get back to that when we, in the second half of our conversation. But this is a more pastoral question that actually came from one of our viewers who asked this. I feel like I'm floundering in learning new technology. How do I find the time and energy to focus on my message?
Let's start here. One of the things just basic time management, I know it's hard, but one of the things that I do and recommend that students do, and in other leadership classes I teach, is time block. Time block your week, time block your day, and go ahead and put in there when you're actually going to do the sermon. And a little bit at a time is actually perfect. I know pastoral ministry is hard, it's demanding, especially in these times, and we all have our own kind of emotions right now as well in terms of momentum. But if there's a time when you can meet yourself, whenever during the week, just block that in and know that no matter how much time you spend or don't spend, you are working on that sermon. This is the other thing. I think that people often get confused that I have to have this one concentrated block of time and then I'm not working on the sermon anymore. As soon as you read the text, you're working on that sermon. Whether you're at the movie, well, no longer, whether you're in front of the movies, on your television screen or somewhere else. The other thing I just want to say about the technology is, gosh, it doesn't have to be perfect. Charlie or Bruce once said this is not about trying to make an entire production. What type, are you a team of 1 or are you a team of 20? If you're a team of 1, what you do is going to be very different than your team of 20. And I think folk just want to know that they're cared for and you're putting in enough effort. You're putting in some effort. So one small piece at a time on the technology. There's no need to try to feel like you have to do a production.
Yeah, well, Lisa, I appreciate all you said, but especially when you gave the advice or giving the advice about, you can work on your sermon a little bit during the week. It doesn't have to be one block of time. And I think a lot of preachers make the mistake of thinking, well, my sermon writing time is in the afternoon or whenever from 2 to 5. And they begin to compartmentalize sermon preparation as opposed to expanding it. No, you're preparing a sermon, whatever you're doing, whatever you're experiencing, whatever you're interpreting. And I think when you get out of that compartmentalizing sermon preparation, your sermons become a lot more effective and it's a lot easier to prepare them. So yeah, I appreciate that.
I would say there's probably 3 things that I would offer. One is to just be easy on yourself. I mean, I think, again, grace is so extended right now because everybody's feeling it. So, I mean, even if you're like, I just couldn't put the time, I'm just going to lead a conversation this week. I mean, I think there's some honesty and some vulnerability that just says you weren't going to try to fake it through this. And I mean, I don't think you can get away with that every Sunday. Grant, let's not get carried away. But I do think there's a real gift right now for folks to be like, yeah, man, we totally get it. I mean, I think there's that, which I think slides into taking time off. I just took my first Sunday off during this time. We started. Our last service was March 8th, and we've been, and I have seriously high control needs about our technology. So I was not going to let this thing go until I knew we could do it. And I told all of our staff, we're not a big church, but I have a couple of other staff people. And I said, the screams you hear are my anxiety giving up control. I trust you completely. And I just went away, and I don't think I realized how tired I was. And I'm a pretty energetic leader and I love pastoring and all that, but I think taking the time away, no matter what, planning for that is important. And then the last thing I would say is there are different patterns are going to develop for how everybody preaches and needs that preparation. So for me, for example, I have to do my outline on Monday and I have to be forced into that so that our admin can start getting the slides ready. And then I don't look at it really intently again until Wednesday when we walk through, and then Friday, I kind of do all my last things. So there are some markers that I have to set that I know people are relying on me. And that's my own personality needing to have accountability. And that's like years of leaving dead bodies in my wake of staff of disappointing and not holding up. But I think everybody has to develop a new pattern of how you're going to prep during this time. because the electronic piece, to get it, we're not looking for perfection and production, but there is a different pace to it. If you're gonna be recording, if you're gonna be recording and editing, if you're gonna be like that piece, it's more work. And I think we can't just roll into Sunday and just lead worship like maybe some have been used to doing. And so I think developing that discipline early as you can, and then tweaking it as you go, because we're in this for a long period. This isn't just kind of we're going to be in for a month or so, and then we're going to all get back to normal. So developing that discipline, I think, will be really important for folks.
Lisa, may I add one thing here?
Please do.
In thinking what, Bruce, you made me think of something else, and just that the idea of buddy systems, right? So when we were switching over to online platform for teaching and trying to do Zoom exclusively for the rest of the semester, I took about 6 hours, not in one chunk, but just to get other people online with me to run through things, to practice things, to figure out how the platform worked, what was actually functional with breakout rooms and all those different things. But if you can find yourself a buddy, a learning buddy, maybe someone knows one trick that you don't yet know, and just run it through. But modestly, right? Set an hour and shut it down and come back to it another day. But that was the only thing I was going to add.
So I'm gonna add on your ad, my ad. So we have this just one little pitch. So I'm committed to Zoom as our worship platform, and I know there's lots of other things, and people are doing creative, amazing things. So we created a Facebook group that was focused on Zoom-centric worship, and there's now about 1,200 people in that group. It's an interfaith. It used to be called Zoom Church, and then we got into some rabbinical list, and then we got into some Wiccan list and some other thing, and we're like, hey, we're now interfaith, so now we're called Zoom Faith. And we meet every Monday at 8 o'clock online, as well as during the week. And it's just that, right? It's people coming in, asking the simplest of questions. Like, and they're so generous. People are so generous. Like, there's no question. People are like, how again do I do this? And everyone's like, it's cool. Just look at here and do that. Or it's these people that are totally nerding out. Like, how do I get into the third level of, settings and all that? And so I think that has created community that's released this idea that I have to figure it all out. And not only do I have to be a pastor, I also have to be the IT department. And I think that just giving yourself permission to lean on other folks who find energy in this, I think is a great gift to yourself. So totally engage with that idea to find other people who you can journey with this along.
We're going to pick back up with this conversation in just a little bit, but I want to just thank our sponsors of this series, Amplify Media. You're going to, in this break, hear a little bit more about the resources that they have for churches and also for worship. So we look forward to seeing you back again for the second part of our conversation.
Amplify is a space in which Christians can explore their faith more deeply in relationship with one another and be equipped to impact even more people for the gospel. You can even stream your church's services, bringing your congregation together even when they aren't in the same building. Engage your ministry and expand your mission by following these simple steps. Get started with Amplify today.
We're back, and we're so grateful to continue this conversation with these three fabulous panelists. Again, we want to thank Amplify Media for being the sponsors of this webinar series. As we kick off this portion of our conversation, I wanted to actually kind of turn it to Lisa, because Lisa was sharing some kind of bullet point best practices as to how we can kind of set ourselves up for success when it comes to preaching online or preaching in front of a camera.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when I think about this list, Lisa, I have to confess that part of this list comes from years ago doing searches on how to interview online better. So, I mean, honestly, so one of the things I like to tell people is to think about the height of the camera, trying to get your camera out from under your nose, above your chin, literally getting at eye level. It makes a big difference. And to think about how do you want to think about cultivating this sense of intimacy, being with people even as you're part. And that actually just involves looking at the camera instead of looking at our boxes or the screen. It's so tempted to look at the boxes or the screen. We'll see if I'm failing or not on the webinar. But also, Bruce said an arm mic, right? So you might be going into full podcast mode. And then don't forget, as best you can, think about a microphone and how you're mic'd into the system. But some other practical things that I'll also talk about just in general in the preaching classroom is to slow down. I'm a fast talker, but honestly, especially in the online context, we sometimes have to over gesture, but also over enunciate, but just to give people time for the information to sink in and the ideas to sink in. The other thing I want to say about preaching and the way that I distinguish oral and oral communication from written communication is to use shorter sentences. In preaching and preaching to the heart and the ear, we want to think about shorter sentences and speaking by way of imagery. So those are some of the things that I would think about. Slowing down, shorter sentences, get that camera height up, and think about looking into the camera instead of being so focused on the screen.
Lighting.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, lighting. Thank you. Yes.
No, and I honestly, and I appreciate that, because I think this, I mean, and a lot of that advice is good just to help sharpen preacher skills just for any preaching setting, even if they're preaching to a congregation. And I think what this does is it gives many preachers an opportunity to sharpen their preaching skills in general, because I think all sermons should have shorter sentences. Sure. And you have to remember that you're preaching for the ear, not for the eye.
Yeah.
And you need to use more imagery. And so hopefully this pushes a lot of preachers to become more effective in their craft. Because like you said, to preach it in front of a camera, that stuff is magnified. You got to be sure you're doing that well. So hopefully you'll be a better preacher after all this stuff is over.
I don't want to lose Bruce's comment on lighting, though. And if I had to make a comment, it would be make sure you have lights in front of you, above you, and not directly facing into the camera. I mean, this is the time to pull out every lamp you have in the house.
So nose hair is not good. I've seen a lot of preachers' nose hairs over the last month,
No comment.
Phone.
My setup in my backyard is really very extra. I have 2 photography lights that are right here, right on the swing arm mic right there. And granted, I love the tech and I love being a little bit extra. So, but I think because I'm backlit, and so you got to really pay attention to how you are presented in there, not just for your own vanity, but just for people to be able to not get distracted by, gosh, this face is so like I can't see, or there's too much stuff going on behind you. For some, making sure because I preach so non-traditionally and I'm doing other things so weirdly, I wear a collar every Sunday. So it kind of, and that solid color actually helps on the look of the camera, on what's going on behind me. I would also encourage preachers, if you're Zooming, do not use the backgrounds. Please, for the love of God, do not use the backgrounds, because they just make it. I don't like them generally, but it also doesn't track you well most of the time, and you start to blur out on the sides. So I'm big for just keep it simple. Just do simple and well done. And that way we're releasing this idea to have these huge productions that most of us can't pull off and are just going to cause us more stress. Just bring it simple. Lighting, mic, sound, microphone, an external mic. I always suggest people get external mic. And some folks don't like using earbuds when they're preaching because if they're doing Zoom. But I think it's worth it if you need to get wirelesses or whatever, but just so the feedback doesn't happen. So sound, mic, lighting, and just keeping it simple would be my suggestions for people.
Mm-hmm. This is another kind of pastoral question. And as pastors of pastors, we all have stress in our personal lives. And I think this pandemic has just exacerbated any worry or anxieties that we have. As a person, comes to the preaching moment, how would you invite folks to both honor their concerns, their anxieties, but also to proclaim hope to their people?
Well, I think this emphasizes the importance of a preacher being vulnerable and real. I think that's the first step in this, is when you preach, whatever message you're preaching, is that you're honest and vulnerable about how you feel, and you're naming the emotions your listeners are experiencing. I think that's half of it. That's powerful. And when you're able to name that in the sermon event, and listeners, oh my gosh, they're experiencing that too. That's exactly how I feel. That's the beginning point to then offering hope. I think, again, this is the opportunity to be authentic and real and to name that for people. I think that's very important. I mean, all preachers should be doing that all the time, but especially now, because they're going to tune out. If you're on the camera and you're acting like everything's hunky-dory and you're happy, it's like, they can't relate to that. Yeah.
I rarely give do's and don'ts when it comes to preaching, right? So I think it is about a preacher cultivating their own wisdom and what I call wit and know-how. And I always ask, for what purpose does this thing serve in the sermon or in the preaching moment? And so if it serves, what purpose does it serve? To be vulnerable, to self-disclose, or to not disclose? And what do you think is going to be the effect of that thing? So it might very well be very appropriate in the moment to say this thing about yourself, what you're feeling, what you're going through. My question is always to the preacher is why are you doing it? And what's the hope for payoff in that, or, response. And my only hesitation is if it's to the point where your listeners are now carrying you and now find themselves caring for you to the point where they can no longer track with you. Well, that might be an opportunity to think about doing something different. The other thing I'll say about hope, I would just think about, what are we looking forward to? This is a time where I think we can reconnect to the idea of lament. That, there is something about hope in lament. We only lament because we think things are not the way they should be, and we hope for something more. So I think during this season of preaching, it is a matter of holding together the idea of grieving what should not be, but because somehow by spirit we know so much more is possible. And if we can figure out how to name what that possibility may be. Finally, I'll just say, how do we want people to feel when they leave? Probably a space where they feel like their concerns, their vulnerability, their own grief has been heard, but also that they have a different outlook for the week ahead, or something to give them for the next moment to be present.
Clearly, I do give do's and don'ts. Do not use Zoom backgrounds when you preach. I have probably a list.
Bruce, how do I access that in properties? I want to pick that up.
I have probably about 20 do's and don'ts. That's kind of my, no, I would say I try to, as one who has the privilege to preach every Sunday to a group of, my question is always, do folks come out of this having some understanding that we're a resurrection people? However we get there, and we're a church that is as progressive as they get out, as any church is going to be. And so sometimes I deeply connected to our Christian faith, but don't always kind of verbalize and aren't always able to speak out to resurrection language and who Jesus is in our lives, that leads us to these very radically progressive theological spaces, which I love. And so my thing with this community my first year has been, we're a resurrection people, right? And so what does this mean? The work that we do is fueled by our belief in that. And there's always hope in that. And so I think helping people to grieve despair in the pace and patterns that God leads them to, but that we're always understanding that we're a resurrection people. And so even in the depth of our despair and the depths of what's going on and the lament, all of that we end giving thanks, whether we can feel it or not, we are a resurrection people, and we're going to live that. Despite what all is going on, that we're going to continue to do that. So I try to be consistent in that with our folks so that, they don't all experience it the same way, but it's become part of our vernacular and our culture to talk about being, claiming the resurrection people. And so that's kind of, so I agree with both of you all as teachers of the craft. We're all told don't bleed all over your congregation, and we all know when we do it, and we learn early on, hopefully, not to do it again. And I think that's we hope we all learn how to do that. But that line between that personal and being too much, I think is always one to just kind of keep watching out for, especially during this time. So.
Lisa, may I say something here?
Yeah,
because
please
this
do.
comment made me think about something, and this idea of resurrection people. And, you know, thinking about the trajectory of Christian faith is that resurrection and new life never escape death. Like they're always tethered to one another. And the resurrection and new life is historically planted within the story that also involves death and the messiness of the human experience. And there are some traditions, some cultures, some people groups who have always lived in this tension more readily than others. So this is an opportunity for folk to also thinking about increasing their resources for preaching and the materials that they use to inform their faith and theologies of preaching and out of which they preach. So this is also an opportunity, like, be in conversation with other communities you might not ordinarily be in conversation with. There are some folk who have always lived in existential crisis. That, you know, suffering is not new. And the pandemic was not the first crisis, right?
Preach it.
Marginalized groups in very particular ways in our society have had to figure out how to still be people of faith and live through suffering every day in very bodily ways. So this is a time where I do want to encourage preachers, like, get conversation partners that you might not ordinarily have.
No, I think that's I appreciate that, Lisa. Thank you for sharing that, because, yeah, I mean, right now everyone's suffering. But you know, suffering, like you said, I appreciate it. It's not anything new for lots of different people, and I think that there's a whole history of Christians and Christian communities who have been able to suffer and suffer well and suffer with hope throughout all this, and to be able to tap into that wisdom, into that experience, and that learning is huge. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You know, I also think that there's something to be said about the fact that this is a collective trauma. And so as in my own church context, I oftentimes say, I don't preach to you, I preach with you. And so now the very things that I'm saying with my community, I have to believe them for myself. You know, I'm not going to be a hope pusher for you if I cannot be a hope pusher for myself. So I think there's something, the preaching moment is making the space narrow between us and our congregants, because we're all journeying through this together. Interestingly enough, we have another question from a viewer, and she says, I find it hard to be emotional as I preach when I can't gauge the reactions of my audience. What advice would you have for her?
Well, I think, again, I hate to be a broken record, but I think whoever asked that question, I imagine the other preachers who are asking that question, have preached in front of a live congregation before in person. And so I think they can tap into those memories and experiences. I don't think it's that far away. And so I think that when they're preparing sermons and going through their mind of how that's going to come across, and Lisa, I appreciate what you said earlier, a sermon is an experience. It's a human experience. It's not an intellectual exercise, just communicating an idea. So I would advise that person to just remember past messages when you were preaching to a congregation that you could see and experience, and just get back into that type of setting within yourself in that state. I think to channel that, again, it may be easier for some than others, but I think that memory is something they can rely on. It's not going to be changed. When people sitting in a living room on a couch listening to your sermon, they're going to have the same emotions as if they were sitting in the pew. It's just remembering that.
And in their pajamas.
Right. You know, some things are different, but some things aren't very different. When you're listening to a sermon and you're coming across with a particular message, they're going to experience that emotionally. Now, you can't see it, but they're going to be there experiencing it, you know, and just to trust that.
Yeah, so I think just like cell memory and, you know, kind of visualizing and experiencing that. And I think there's also something about being convicted by your own preaching. Like, is your own preaching moving you? Because if your own preaching is not moving you, I think there's some questions around why is that? And not every sermon is going to be as profound as we would like them to be, but at a certain level, if you're not being stirred, if God's not stirring something inside your own spirit, it's going to be hard to generate that emotion from outside. So I would be more of like, okay, so let's think about what moves you in this passage. Like, what really stirs your soul, so that you're not relying necessarily on the reactions of others. Again, I'm not discounting that, but I think there is this, like, making sure that that it's not purely a kind of, I need you all to tell me how I'm doing, but that there's this conversation you're having with God that you're getting to express. And so what does that mean for you to really recapture what I think is a powerful way of preaching, is understanding you're getting transformed as you're preaching and going through that process, so that you can generate that internally, the energy and the excitement and conviction that you want others to experience. So I think it's both and. I mean, kind of figuring out how you're reacting and being able to adapt, it's harder to do. But at the same time, gosh, if that's happening over and over again, where you're not convicted by your own preaching, there's a deeper kind of well that needs to be tapped into. Not saying you can't transition, but I think the well, maybe we're just skimming from the top, and you need to drop the bucket down a little bit further and be moved by your own words and your own experience.
Well, Bruce, and if I can jump in, I thank you for saying that, because I've often said that the secret sauce of great preaching is conviction. And there's nothing more compelling than a convicted preacher. And I think if you don't have that on your own conviction about your message, if you're not excited about the message, nobody else is going to be excited about it. And so if you don't have it while you're preparing a message, you need to scrap it and go on to something else. So yeah, I appreciate amen, brother. I think that's great.
I appreciate all this language about being able to connect to the message you're preaching. One of the things I always say is that, yes, the message works on the preacher first, and they need to figure out where they resonate with that message first. I also want to acknowledge that we know the ups and downs of preaching ministry, that sometimes we are in our own states of depression, our own states of like trauma, our own states of just emotional and mental fatigue. So then the question is, where am I at the place where I just can't feel a thing? Yep. And then how do I figure out that message? And one of the things I like to say is, what's at stake in this message for you? Right. So, and the question, so even if let's say I'm in my own personal sadness or whatever else, that there has to be a point for whatever message we're preaching where we determine what's at stake. What's at stake in the message being preached? What's at stake if the message is not preached at all? And if we can find that kind of what that thing is, I think there we find the conviction, there we find our belief in the thing. And that's where we can say, this message has worked on me, and then channel that outward, because you know something is at stake if this doesn't come across. So that's what I would want to say most in terms of like how to get that emotional connection back across in an empty room. But finally, well, let's not glorify the in-person preaching moment and the energy we think we receive, right? We've all preached the sermon where we get deadpan faces from the pulpit and get to the back reception, receiving line, and people are like, that was an amazing message. So just to be honest, that sometimes that in-person feedback can give us false senses of what's actually happening in the minds of listeners. So don't underestimate what's actually happening, even in the online format, is what I
had a person that would always greet me at the end and say to me, "You always have next Sunday."
That's terrible.
You didn't get.
That's awful.
No, it was done with great love and humor, and he would alternate between "You always have next Sunday" and "Nice try."
Yeah. He would certainly be one of my favorite people, Bruce.
Oh yeah, no, it was all in good jest and fun. You always have next Sunday always got me every time. Just made me laugh.
Lisa, I think that's great wisdom that you just shared, because it's true. I think you can misinterpret the energy and the reaction of your listeners. And I think, again, if you've preached for any length of time, you've gone through that experience. You're like, well, did they even get any of this? And then later in the receiving line or through emails later, yeah, they got it, but they didn't look like they got it. I mean, yeah, so I think people respond differently, and we can overanalyze how people are responding to, the way we preach. And I think sometimes we can put too much into that.
I'm going to just throw out our last question really quickly. Over your years of preaching and digital media, what is your favorite piece of advice for pastors?
Oh gosh, favorite piece of advice. We just have to pick one.
Charley, for you, you can do two.
Well, I think this would apply to whether you're preaching in front of a camera or preaching, in person. And again, I wouldn't say this is the most important, but it certainly makes my top 10 list. And that is, can you name in one sentence what your sermon is about? I think that if I served on the board of ordained ministry for years, analyzing sermon after sermon, oh my gosh, that was, I won't go into that. The number one problem with many of the sermons is they try to put 10 sermons in one. In one simple sentence, what is the point of your sermon? And if you can't name it in one succinct sentence, then you got a problem. So I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces of advice I would get. You got to whittle it down to one simple sentence. If you don't, because, what's the old statement? A mist in the pulpit is a fog in the pew. So if it's not clear to you, it's not going to be clear to the people. So anyway, that's one of them.
That's good.
So I would, I'm going to take two then too. So I think this is a little cheesy, but I think about it is your sermon tweetable? Can you put what is whoever's live tweeting your sermon, could they put in one tweet what your sermon was about?
No.
And as we do that with I got to make sure that at the end of the day, if I could ask one of our folks, I'm like, can you just tweet out, what did I talk about? And then that can go out. So that's one. And then I've always just said, find a preacher God's calling you to be. Because I think too often we're trying to be, we see a preacher or we see a style or we think that's what the kind of preacher I want to be. And maybe that's the kind of preacher you're going to be, but maybe it's not. And so really taking seriously that God has called you into the preaching moment, but you have to enter that and develop who you are as a preacher. And that, again, is going to shift and change over time, but to not try to be the kind of preacher you think you're supposed to be, but be the kind of preacher that God intends you to be and become.
I would say just to remember that every sermon is a calculated risk and an offering at the end of the day, right? And so no matter if it's online, if it's in person, we are taking a calculated and making a calculated risk. So when it's over, offer it up as your offering to the people and to God, and do another risk next Sunday or the next session.
Lisa, is that your quote?
That's my quote. That's my quote.
All right. I'm going to give you credit for that. That's a good one, because that's totally true. Right.
You ought to write a book about that, Lisa.
Yeah,
I got it. If I only had it already.
Lisa says.
Is that the title?
That'll work.
That's a great title, or a podcast or something.
We are coming to the close of our conversations. I just want to say thank you to our panelists, and to thank those of you who tuned into this particular episode. I always leave us with this one question, and that is, what is bringing you hope today? And I hope that you will literally let that be your manna as you rehearse God's goodness in your life on where hope is falling down for you, where God has been merciful for you. We hope that you will join us for our next episode. We're going to be talking about the financial concerns that you brought up in the survey. We'll have pastors joining with us who teach on stewardship and also giving, and we'll have a fundraising expert who will also join us for that conversation. You can find out more information at amplifymedia.com/now-and-next to register. Just so you know, all of the information that we have talked about today, links to our panelists' books will be offered to you after this episode airs, and also in an email to you. So we want you to know that we're going to continue to resource you. It was so good for you to be with us, so good to be with you three panelists, and we do look forward to seeing you all again for episode 4.